can talk a little bit about what we see. We see some unusual acquisition. We see some unusual saving behavior. And we see disorganization. Now, I want to talk in some detail about each of these because these are the three things that make up this problem. The acquisition piece, we see a little bit of that so far with Irene, with collecting this stuff, putting it in the hallway. The saving behavior, inability to throw any of this stuff away. The disorganization we see. If her home was organized, she might be able to function a lot better, right? Because the volume was moderate, but it wasn't all the way to the ceiling. It wasn't extreme, okay? So this disorganization is a big piece of it. So let's talk first about acquisition. There are 4 ways in which acquisition occurs in hoarding problems. And the first is buying stuff, basically compulsive buying of stuff. To give you an idea of what this is like, Irene is a great example. She cannot go to New York City because if she goes to New York City, invariably, walking along the street, she sees a news kiosk. They're everywhere in New York. All the magazines, newspapers, candies, gums, stuff like that. When she sees a news kiosk like that, she thinks to herself, look at all those newspapers and all those magazines. Somewhere in all of that, there's a piece of information that could change my life. How can I walk away without it? And it's so hard for her that the only way she can do it is to cross to the other side of the street and look away. And what's that called? Avoidance behavior. Anytime people are avoiding an unpleasant emotion, you know there's trouble coming. Okay? And so Irene, in order to avoid that, avoids going to New York City. We've seen other cases of this sort of compulsive buying behavior that not so much information-based, but more sentimentally based. We had one of our cases, a woman who used to buy a lot on shopping channels. And she was sitting one day, she told us this story, she was sitting one day watching some kind of shopping channel where, you know, where the stuff comes up and you submit a bid, you buy it. Well, she's watching, and up on the screen comes a wooden puppet. And she thinks to herself, I'm not particularly interested in a wooden puppet. I'm not going to buy a wooden puppet. So she's sitting there, and the wooden puppet's there, and nobody has bid on it. She's sitting there, and nobody has bid on it. And nobody's bid on it. And she thinks to herself, that poor puppet. And so she bids on the puppet and buys it. And then the TV manager must have figured out, the station manager must have figured out, that's a pretty good deal, so he puts up another one. And she buys a bunch of them. Not because she wanted them, but because she developed an affinity with them. One of the things we're starting to take a look at now is the extent to which people with hoarding problems experience this intense kind of anthropomorphism, ascribing human-like qualities to physical objects, which is quite strong in folks with hoarding problems. So buying things, compulsive buying is sort of complicated in that it's not just a single reason, but some kind of an attachment that forms between the person and an object because of the way in which they think about that object. Now, the other thing we see is the accumulation of free stuff. Irene has an arrangement with the local postmaster. Any newspapers and magazines that can't be delivered because the address is smudged, he puts them in a box, and on Saturday morning, he puts them out in the foyer of the post office, and she comes by on her way to the tag sales, because tag sales are things that she does, and she picks them up. Her home is filled with this stuff. Now, the other thing about buying and free stuff is for Irene And for many people with this problem, what they say is, this is what gives me joy. Nothing else in my life is going right. This I enjoy. So it's important for us to keep that in mind, because if we want them to stop this behavior, we're asking them to give up the joy in their life. And that's a significant barrier and something we have to deal with when we think about treatment. Now, stealing behavior, we don't see a lot of stealing behavior in hoarding, but we see somewhere between 5 and 10% of the cases find stuff so irresistible that they can't stop themselves from picking it up. It's not very frequent. It is more than what we see in the general population, but it's still relatively low frequency in these cases. And finally, passive acquisition. How long would it take for your home to fill up if you never threw away those letters from Citibank asking you to take out another credit card? We get lots of mail that just sort of comes in. If we just never get rid of it, our home will eventually fill up. So the acquisition piece is a big part of this. And I'll come back to it and talk a little bit more about how big in a few minutes. The compulsive saving part, the second part, we can think about it as compulsive saving, but we can also think about it as simply difficulty letting go of things or discarding things. The types of items saved, quite interesting. The first study we did with these 100 people who called us is we asked them, what types of things do you save? And we put them into categories, and then we asked people who didn't have a hoarding problem, well, what types of things do you save? And lo and behold, they were exactly the same. People with hoarding problems, for the most part, save exactly the same things as the rest of us, in proportion. And the most often are things like clothes, newspapers, books, containers. Those are the most frequent kinds of items. Now, sometimes there are more unusual items. So sometimes there are body parts. Now, I don't mean like arms and legs, but like hair and stuff like that. Sometimes it is more gross things like excrement, things of that sort. We sometimes see those. Most often, those cases involve other comorbidities that sort of direct the content of this. So we see a little bit of that with schizophrenia, a little bit of that with OCD. And sometimes we see a funny kind of life editing OCD. Now this phenomena, you don't see it very often, but you do see it occasionally, where people feel the necessity to record and save every piece of their life. So with OCD, sometimes you see people writing their experience all the time or filming themselves. We had one case, took it a step further, and what she did was videotape every talk show while she was alive. And that was her goal. And she just got panicky if one of her 8 VCRs stopped working, because that meant she missed a show. And even once when she had an accident, she was taken to the emergency room. She was in intensive care, and she panicked because that meant she couldn't start her VCR in one of the shows that she needed to start. So you see this funny kind of overlap sometimes between these OCD symptoms and symptoms of hoarding. Now, one of the myths about hoarding is that it involves the saving or the inability to let go of worthless and worn out things. Now, it's true that people with this problem have a hard time getting rid of stuff that other people consider worthless and worn out. But really, that's only one small piece of it. People with hoarding problems have trouble letting go of anything. And so we've had cases where the homes were absolutely full of clothes that were purchased and the tags never taken off of them. They're brand new stuff. It's not a problem with worthless and worn out things. It's a problem with everything. The reason DSM-4 is written up here is that in DSM-4, there was a diagnostic criteria for obsessive compulsive personality disorder that was like hoarding. And it basically was the inability to discard worthless and worn out things. The misconception is that that hoarding is associated with discarding worthless and worn out things. It's really, as I said, difficulty getting rid of anything. Now, as you may know, hoarding disorder is now included as a separate disorder in DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. That just happened in 2013. The definition and diagnostic criteria basically were taken from our initial definition of hoarding, this failure, acquisition of and failure to discard possessions. So the types of items are one piece of the puzzle. The next thing about the saving behavior and the inability to throw things away is that it seems to be based on the nature of the attachments people have to these objects. And that's one of the primary diagnostic criteria for hoarding, that the person is intentionally keeping these things. All right, now that separates it from other disorders. So we sometimes see people with Alzheimer's or dementia whose homes fill up with stuff, not because they want the stuff, just that they don't have the capability of getting rid of it. Here, for a diagnosis of hoarding disorder, the person has to have the intention to save the article and keep it. The nature of these attachments, another thing we asked this group of 100 people we started with, why do you save the things you save? And the reasons we got, we compared them to the reasons of people who don't have a hoarding problem. And what we found was that the reasons people save things, people with hoarding disorder, are exactly the same as the reasons the rest of us save things. And those reasons seem to fall into three different categories. The first is sentimental or emotional. So saving that ticket stub from a favorite concert you went to, or saving some kind of memento of a special event in your life. This is one of the primary reasons why people with hoarding save things. Now, these examples of these things tell us a little bit more about the nature of the sentimental attachment, that in some ways this attachment is more extreme, more rigid, and applied to a wider variety of things. So with Irene, for example, I was working with her one day in the room with all of the newspapers. And we had this system where we had two boxes here, and one box was for recycling. So she was going to take the papers, decide to recycle them, put them in this box. The other box was for the things she was going to save. So she is working along, and she picks up an ATM envelope. And it was, the envelope that an ATM machine will spit out your money in sometimes. It was empty. It was about 5 years old. There was a date on it. On the back, she'd written how she spent the money. It wasn't anything all that unusual, grocery store items, drugstore items, a few other things. She put it in the recycle box, and she started to cry. And she said, "It feels like I'm losing that day in my life. I still remember that day. I remember this stuff. I still have some of it." And she said, "If I throw away too much, there'll be nothing left of me." And so what we do often in treatment, it came out of this experience, is we ask people to experiment with things like this and to keep up with the experiment. So she was feeling horrible. And I said, "Okay, well, can you keep going? Can we just keep going?" She said, "Yeah." So she picked up other stuff. She put stuff on top of that ATM envelope as she's going along. 10 minutes later, the stuff covers that envelope. And I said, "Well, how do you feel now about the envelope?" She looked at me and she said, "Well, that wasn't such a good day." And then it was okay. But she said, "It would be different if I could see it. If I could see it, I don't know if I could get rid of it." Again, this visual processing that's quite impactful in terms of her decisions to save or get rid of things. Instrumental attachments, by that what we mean is we save things that are of use to us. So you save your driver's license, right? Because it's of use to you. You use it. I didn't show you the other side of Irene's kitchen. But you know the space between your refrigerator and the cupboard around it? Hers was stuffed full of hundreds of cardboard tubes from the inside of toilet paper rolls. And what she said was, those would make great art projects. And I'm saving them for my son's art teacher. Again, this generosity of spirit. But she didn't even know her son's art teacher. She had no idea whether he would want them or not. But she had the thought that here is a use for this possession. A use that could be great, and someone might appreciate it. And otherwise, this stuff is just going to go into the trash. All right? That's an interesting thought. And maybe that's a lesson that we should learn about this problem. That all of us throw away stuff that has utility to someone. And we don't think a thing about it. And keep that in mind, because maybe that's something that is important for us as a lesson from people with this problem. We'll come back to that. That's because that's an interesting idea. Now, the third kind of attachment we see is intrinsic. That is, it doesn't have emotional meaning, doesn't have monetary value, it's just something the person likes, like a picture on the wall. So I got to Irene's one day, and her eyes lit up, and she said, I've got to show you something. She went in the next room. She came back with this large, clear plastic bag filled with bottle caps. And she said, look at these bottle caps. Aren't they beautiful? Look at the shape and the color and the texture. And at that moment, I knew I should never have dropped out of art appreciation in high school. Because I couldn't see it. When I see a bottle cap without a bottle, the only thing I'm thinking is trash. How do I get rid of it? But for Irene, what's going on in her head? All these thoughts, this panoply of thoughts about what I can do with this and how beautiful it is and so forth, an appreciation for the physical world that I either never had or somehow learned to get rid of for efficiency's sake. Okay, an important piece of the puzzle that there is in these folks an appreciation, an aesthetic appreciation for the physical world that I think is a kind of giftedness. They see things in the physical world that the rest of us don't. And they appreciate it, and they value it. The problem is it gets in their way. And that's what's happened with Irene. The conditions of the home, this disorganization piece, is also important. So the condition of the home reflects this disorganization, tons and tons of clutter, a mixture of important and unimportant things. One day I was working with Irene. I got there and she said, I think today I can throw away a whole New York Times without looking at it. And I said, great. She said, let me just shake it to make sure there's nothing there. And she shook it, and out fell another ATM envelope with $100 in cash. Not a great therapeutic moment. And I wondered later whether maybe she planted it. But I don't think she did. But when we see something like this, the first thought, and maybe it's why people originally thought this is all worthless and worn out stuff, what's in there is the title to her car and a diamond ring she lost a couple of months ago. It's in there somewhere. It's all mixed together. So the condition of the home reflects this mixed importance. The behavior also reflects this disorganization, this churning behavior, very inefficient, disorganized, and a fear of putting things out of sight. I didn't show you her bedroom. It looked like the rest of the house. Her clothes were piled on the dresser all the way to the ceiling, but her dresser drawers were empty. And what she said was, if I put my clothes in the drawer, I won't be able to see them. And if I can't see them, I won't remember that I have them. And that may be why. This visual processing again. The stuff ends up in the middle of the room because you can see it. And it creates a different way of organizing the world. Most of us live our lives categorically, right? We get an electricity bill, we put it with the utility bill somewhere, we put it in a folder. It's in a category. If we want to find the individual member, we go to that category and search for it. But Irene and many people with this problem don't organize their world that way. Her world is organized visually and spatially. And if she wants to remember where her electricity bill is, she has to think back to when it came and where I put it on the pile. So her organization is this mental map she has of that pile of papers. And she remembers where things are in space, in 3 dimensions. So if someone comes in and touches or moves anything in that pile, what happens? They've destroyed her map. That's like going into your home and dumping out your file cabinet. So you can see why the intensity is involved with anyone going in and moving or touching any of this stuff. All right, so some data. Prevalence rates. Somewhere between 2 and 5%. This is a summary of the different prevalence studies for hoarding that have been done, all the way from the US to Sweden. The lowest of these estimates was in the UK at 1.5%. But in that study, 1.5% of the population, in that study, the way they calculated hoarding cases was to go door to door and knock on the door. If nobody answered, they didn't get counted. So you know what it's like with someone with this problem, they're less likely to open the door. So that's probably a low estimate. So we think it's somewhere between 2 and 5% of the population, an enormous number. 3 to 4 times what it is for something like obsessive compulsive disorder, which we once thought this was a part of. Comorbid disorders, I talked about the comorbidity. The most frequent comorbidity is major depressive disorder. Over half of the cases that we see of hoarding disorder are comorbid for depression. We also see high comorbidity for generalized anxiety disorder, disorder characterized by worry. Social anxiety disorder or social phobia, also high. ADHD, very high in this sample. OCD, somewhat. PTSD, not too much. Now, the PTSD connection is important. Remember that, because we'll come back to that in a minute. Now, we've also turned around this study. Instead, here, we're looking at the presence of disorders in hoarding cases. We've also done a study where what we did was we looked for the presence of hoarding in anxiety disorder cases. And these cases, there were 139 of them coming into the clinic, and not a single one of them said anything to their clinician about hoarding problems. So we're looking at anxiety disorder cases that otherwise the clinician would have no idea there was hoarding going on. And what we see is for generalized anxiety disorder, this disorder characterized by worry, a quarter of them had significant hoarding problems for which they never complained to their therapist about. About 18% had social anxiety, and about 11 or 12% had OCD. So this is a hidden disorder, even in people who are perfectly willing to admit that they have another disorder. Age of onset begins somewhere, most often, between 10 and 20 years old. Interesting, because most of the cases we see are older. The behavior starts early, but it does not get severe until decades later. And so if we look at severity here, by age 40 or so, it's really up to a pretty moderate or severe level, and it stays there. Unlike most of the other anxiety disorders, this disorder does not seem to get better as people get older. The prevalence of anxiety disorders goes down a bit as you get older, not so for hoarding. The hazards that we see, poor sanitation is one. We don't know for sure. There's not a lot of research on squalor or unsanitary conditions in hoarding, but somewhere between 10 and 20% of the cases probably fit in this category. This is the kitchen of the home of a former head nurse at a hospital. Mobility hazards, you can see this is the home of a 50-something-year-old man, and trying to get up and down those stairs for this gentleman could be a difficulty as he gets older. Blocked exits, this person would not be able to get out. Community costs to do a cleanup of homes can run $10,000, $20,000, $30,000, sometimes more. Homelessness, we see an elevation in the frequency of hoarding behavior in homeless populations. A number of people become homeless because of their hoarding. We've had cases where people have been evicted from their home and they have just enough money to put all their stuff in storage, but not enough money for them to find a place to live. And finally, fire hazards. This is the home of an elderly gentleman just outside of Boston whose home was stacked high with newspapers, caught fire, he couldn't get out, and he died in the fire. It turns out we don't see a high frequency of hoarding fires, but the ones that exist are deadly. So this is a significant problem. We've probably seen news reports of really dramatic fires related to hoarding from, for instance, Toronto a few years ago, a big fire in a 700-unit apartment building, displaced over 1,500 people for several months because of the fire. So, in conclusion, what I want to get across is, first of all, what we see here in hoarding, I think we want to think about it a little bit differently. That in some ways, the kinds of characteristics we see represent a gift. And that gift involves recognizing the potential utility and opportunity provided by physical objects. And second is an aesthetic appreciation of the physical world that the rest of us, I think, have kind of conditioned ourselves out of in order to live our lives more efficiently. And those are the gifted parts of this problem. The curse that goes along with it is that for many people, this results in their living in a landfill, basically. Living among stuff that other people would throw in the landfill. And as one of the clients from Stuff said once, she said, you know, I am collecting life without living it. And that's a key characteristic here for many people. And what we see in terms of the activity that is involved with the stuff that is collected is quite unusual. We see people who collect things. Once they get into the home, they never interact with that object again. So it's sort of an interesting piece of this, that once the stuff comes in and they own it, they don't do anything with it. Now, it's not, and it's not that they can let go of it either. It's as though every time they see it, it brings back that reward characteristic of that thing. And just a brief story about that sort of brings home the sense of the way in which reinforcement occurs here. Irene saved cookbooks, and she had 300-some cookbooks. She saved every recipe in the newspaper. She saved every magazine that had a recipe in it, but she never cooked. So why? Why did she save those things? Well, if you think about the way in which most of us save things, what rewards us, what reinforces us for saving things? The thing that reinforces us for saving is most often the use of that possession. So you save a cookbook because you use the recipes that are in it. But for Irene, it's not the use of the recipes that she finds reinforcing. For her, what happens is when she looks at a recipe in a cookbook, she has a fantasy. And that fantasy, that dream, is like, what can I do with this recipe? I could have a dinner party and invite my friends over. I could cook this recipe. It would be delicious. My friends would love it. We'd have a lovely evening talking about things. Thinking about it is what juices her. That's where she gets her reinforcement. It's not the use of the object that she finds reinforcing. It's the dream the object allows her to dream. The image of herself as a good cook, good citizen, well-read person. That's what drives her to save these things. It's not the use of the possession, but the dream the possession allows her to dream. In many ways, this is ownership gone awry. All right. I think there are a couple minutes left for questions. Yes. Question about the attachment piece. Yeah. Yeah, good question. Have we done any studies on attachment issues in childhood? We have only a little bit of data on the kind of childhoods people have. One of our first hypotheses was that, maybe this is because of people living through a period of material deprivation early in life. You hear about people living through the Depression, and that prompts it. Well, we've found no evidence that that's the case. We also, if you look at Irene and her ability to touch people, she was a wonderful person, easy to get to like. She was just a lovely person, and she had lots of friends, so she had no problem making attachments to people. In fact, what she said was, these things are what keep me connected to the world. I look for things that will connect me to other people. What we have found is that there seems to be a problem with a lack of warmth early in life. Now, we also know, and this is interesting, going back to the PTSD connection, about half of people with hoarding problems, from what we can tell, have experienced some significant trauma. But that has not led to an elevation in PTSD symptoms. And one possibility, and we were talking about this just the other night, one possibility is the collection of all this stuff and having this stuff around may form a buffer against the development of PTSD. We don't know that yet, but it is one hypothesis that we've sort of developed. So that sort of encapsulates a lot of what we know about the background variables that might be contributing to the development of this. We'll talk, in the breakout this afternoon, I'll talk much more about the why and the background, but it is also partly genetic. So that's a part of it as well. Yes?
I'm interested in the layering feature and whether there's some chronological aspect to the saving. I mean, even though it's sifted and
So the question is there a chronological order to the pile? It doesn't appear to be. I mean, the pile gets churned so often. But there's also something about this image that gets formed. I had one case of a fellow who was an event planner. He planned big events. And he told me once, he said, I had this event a couple weeks ago, and I can't remember a thing about it because he lost the folder that was associated with it. Well, when he found the folder, he could remember everything, but he didn't even open the folder. Just the side of the folder. It's like this object was a key that unlocked the memory and all the memories associated with that event. So we think one of the things going on is that people are using memory strategies in a different way than the rest of us. And these objects are all memory cues. So think about Irene and this day. That was the key unlocking the memory of that day in her life. And we see them relying on that kind of memory. Yeah. Yes. PTSD stands for post-traumatic stress disorder. So like combat stress or other kinds of stress-related disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder. Yes. She pointed at someone. I'm not sure who. Okay.
What happened to Irene?
What happened to Irene? I have the after pictures this afternoon, but.
You said Irene was like a spatial recognition kind of
Yes.
thinker. Is there any evidence that would show us that perhaps other people that have things like dyslexia, where they are more of a 3D thinker, are there higher rates of folks like that in hoarding, or vice versa?
That I don't know. I don't know. No one's looked at that. Interesting question, though. There's one.
About the memory and the object, are there any studies being done about associations with memory disorder and some kind of long-term or short-term memory issues?
Yeah, we've done a couple of studies looking at actual memory deficits. And there are some memory deficits, but they're relatively minor. What is major is a lack of confidence in memory. And that's what's quite unusual, because when Irene picked up an object, she could tell you every detail about how the day she got that object and why and all kinds of things in enormous detail. But yet her thinking, what she continually says is, I have a terrible memory, I can't remember anything. And I think what's happening here is she's relied so heavily on this visual memory aid that she doesn't have any confidence in memory outside of the visual cueing process. So there are some memory deficits, but they're not big enough to explain what's going on. How do animals come into play? Ah, good question. The hoarding of animals may or may not be the same thing. We don't know yet. There are many similarities. But what the differences that we see in people who hoard animals is we see a great deal more delusional thinking and a great deal more mission-driven kinds of stuff. So in stuff, we have a chapter on a woman who had 200 cats. She lived in New York City with 200 cats. But those paled in comparison to her psychiatrist who had 700 cats, all in one building in Manhattan. And yeah, yeah. Yes, yes. We do know some things about these folks. We know they tend to be very isolated, and that feeds into it because they get no feedback about their behavior. So they're very isolated. They believe that they are the only ones who can take care of these animals. Their view is, I'm better at this than even a veterinarian, despite the fact that you walk into their home and there are dead and dying animals on the floor, but yet the belief that I'm taking care of them. There's also this funny belief about my ability to communicate with animals. So the woman with 200 cats in New York and their group, the psychiatrist had almost a dozen patients doing this. And their belief was that they were saving the cats of New York. And any cat who showed up, that meant that that cat was giving them this psychic message that they needed saving. And they would collect it, even though it might belong to somebody else. Because it showed up, so it's a whole belief system that looks much more delusional than we see in object hoarding. And it makes it much harder to deal with. Much harder to deal with.
She has a question. Dr. Frost, what do you recommend to take action and get hoarding workable?
Say that again.
What do you recommend to do to take action and get hoarding workable?
Okay, so I think as we go through today, there'll be a lot of information about that. Because what we've done, we've developed a therapy for hoarding, and it works not as well as therapies for some other disorders, but it does work for many folks. We've also worked on other strategies that are facilitated self-help groups, and you'll learn something about that as well. This is more than a problem for mental health. This is a problem for many different professions, many different areas, and there are many different ways of dealing with the problem, all of which are valuable, and I think many of them are represented here today. So hopefully for the rest of the day you'll learn about that. All right, thank you very much.